Let's start by checking in on the mainstream media because right now, left-wing media outlets are having a meltdown. Why? Because Donald Trump has accepted a small number of refugees from South Africa. This week, the Trump administration granted 59 white South Africans refugee status because they're victims of government-sponsored racial discrimination in their homeland, according to the White House. This is what President Donald Trump had to say.
White farmers are being brutally killed and their land is being confiscated in South Africa, and the newspapers and the media, television media, doesn't even talk about it. If it were the other way around, they'd talk about it. That would be the only story they'd talk about.
So the Trump administration has granted refugee status to these 59 men, women and children because there have been a spate of murders of farmers in South Africa. And yet the same mainstream media outlets that seem to have no problem with Joe Biden's open border policy that allowed almost 10 million illegals to cross the border, including some on a terror watch list, suddenly have an issue with these 59 refugees from South Africa being granted asylum in the US. This is some of what went to air on MSNBC's panel, where nearly every commentator sounded devastated that America was taking in these men, women and children. And one guest even suggested that the situation in South Africa isn't that serious because, quote, only a small handful of white farmers have been murdered.
There's just been a small handful of farmers that have been killed over the past 10 years. No land has actually been expropriated. So it's just a farce and a sham and a moral ugliness.
Only a handful. In recent years, there have been 300 farm attacks and at least 50 murders. Not that any amount should be okay. But the hysteria does not stop there on MSNBC. Here is their political analyst, Donna Edwards, suggesting that Donald Trump is only doing this because he's racist.
Well, in my view, what makes it different is that they are white South Africans. The president, in my view, has not hidden his racism behind a bushel. In fact, in his policies, whether it's removing government workers or, in this case, admitting white South Africans while denying refugee status, asylum seekers from other countries, principally Central and South American and Black nations to come into this country. And so I think that, this policy, while it's not surprising in this action, really speaks of the underlying message in this that disrespects and shows disdain for people of color.
On Monday, the 59 refugees arrived in the United States and many held up USA flags and posters thanking President Donald Trump. And this MSNBC reporter will tell you that it is appalling to suggest that these people would likely assimilate in America. And this reporter even went so far to suggest that there is no race-based violence in South Africa.
The Trump administration, they're saying that essentially these white South Africans assimilate better and they're also not as much of a security risk. That's really causing a lot of people to be appalled, frankly. And I also should tell people that this violence that they're talking about that are dealing with these Afrikaners, I've been hearing from people that say there is violence in South Africa, but it's affecting everybody of every single race, Katie.
Once again, the mainstream media in meltdown. They're not just up to their old tricks, but they're straight up lying to you. Joining us now is Chief Economist at the Institute of Public Affairs, Adam Crichton. Adam, thank you so much for joining us. I want to get your thoughts on the media's reaction to the Trump administration's decision to welcome a group of 59 white South African refugees because they are facing violence and discrimination at home. Now, the left-wing media seem to be panicking about this, and there were even suggestions on Don Lemon's podcast that farmers that are coming in could be replacing farmers here in America. Take a listen to this.
The white Afrikaners who were allowed into the country and what that means for the Black folks and the Black farmers, what's going to end up, and the Black farmers who've lost so much land over the decades here in the United States because of the racist policies. What does this do? What does this mean? When you see this, what do you think?
Well, Don, this is a slap in the face to America's Black farmers right now. Here you have the President of the United States flying in white farmers.
And it's not just on that podcast, on outlets like MSNBC. There's just so much of that type of language getting thrown out there. It seems that there's a bit of a double standard here. There were no problems when there was Joe Biden's open border policy, letting in millions of illegals crossing the border. But now that we have 59 refugees from South Africa, well, that's alarming.
Yeah, look, it is just hilarious. As you say, there've been at least 5 million migrants pour into the United States during the Biden administration, depending on what figures you look at, and the left largely celebrated that in the US. They certainly didn't complain, and it just is laughable that these 59 white farmers from South Africa, which I understand have been granted refugee status, will be allowed in the US, and they do suffer persecution, as I understand it, back in South Africa. So I think it's perfectly valid of the US to let them in. I mean, I think probably the left's angry about it because these 59 farmers probably would end up voting for the Republican Party if they ever became US citizens. And, maybe this is too cynical, but I think the reason the left generally likes huge amounts of immigration is because those immigrants tend to support the Democrat Party eventually.
Yeah, it's a very valid point. Look, I want to talk to you about the trade war. Right now, global stock markets are soaring in the wake of the trade truce between the US and China. Now, the agreement implements a 90-day cooling off period, bringing a temporary end to the trade war. So US tariffs on Chinese imports, which were jacked up to 145% last month, will be scaled down to 30%, and Beijing lowered its tariffs from 125% to just 10%. Now, this is what Donald Trump has had to say about dealing with China.
One of the things I think that could be most exciting for us and also for China is that we're trying to open up China because, as you know, many years ago we opened up the USA. Now it's time for China to open up, and that's part of our deal. And we're going to open up China. To me, that's the most exciting part. But, yeah, we made a deal. The relationship is very good. I've always had a good relationship with President Xi. It was interrupted because of COVID, obviously. But outside of that, I've always had a great relationship, a lot of respect for him. And we'll see how that all works out. But we have the confines of a very, very strong deal with China. But the most exciting part of the deal, it was mentioned, but we don't talk about it yet. That's the opening up of China to U.S. business. And that would be like opening up a whole new world, and I think it would be even better for China.
Adam, what's your assessment of where this is at the moment?
Well, look, I think the fact that there's a deal is fantastic. Okay, it's only 90 days, but if you go back a month or so, I think most commentators thought the world was practically going to end with all the discussion of the tariffs. But both the Chinese and the Americans have been sensible and pragmatic, and they've reduced those tariffs from, as you say, 3 figures to 2 figures. I think 30% tariffs now on Chinese goods going into the US and 20% the other way. So they are significantly higher, but obviously much, much lower. And trade will continue between the two countries. This is great for Australia too, of course, because China obviously buys a lot of our exports, and things that are bad for the Chinese economy are certainly bad for the Australian economy too. So we should celebrate that here. But the point that Trump makes there is broadly right. The US has been fairly conducive to free trade for a very long time, and other countries are not. The places like China and also the European Union have imposed a whole array of tariff and non-tariff barriers on American goods. And so the US president, has every right to be frustrated by those and to seek their removal.
And as you say, just a month ago, it was as if the world was ending. And it's always good to have your perspective here on Power Hour, because so much of the mainstream media were freaking out.
I was right.
That's right. Is it too early to say you were right? Look, let's just go back 4 weeks and look at some of the headlines and the messages that we were being told. In The Economist, that had the headline, President Trump's mindless tariffs will cause economic havoc. And if you listen to the Democrats, well, this is what Elizabeth Warren claimed would happen to the economy.
Comes in and basically starts the dumbest trade war in the history of this country. This is going to be about potentially millions of people losing their jobs. It's going to be about millions of people losing their savings, many of people losing their retirement security, and at the same time taking on even higher costs for everything they buy. So that's going to push us in potentially to foreclosures or people being pushed out of their apartments. I remember this from 2008. and how long it took us to dig our way out. And to this day, there are families, there are communities that still haven't recovered. Recessions can be all those fancy charts and graphs, but at the end of the day, people feel them one person at a time, and they can be devastating.
Adam, and in just a matter of weeks, we've seen the stock market recover. We've seen a deal being done. You know, you were right.
Yeah, look, the jobless rate in the US is still very low, as I understand it, below 5%, I think. As you say, the stock market's been booming again. Look, it's early days. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I mean, clearly forecasts like that have just been proved hopelessly wrong so far. I mean, as a general rule, things are never quite as bad or good as they seem. That's kind of my philosophy in life. So, you know, when you see hysteria, it's probably misplaced. And we certainly saw a lot of that in relation to these deals. So, look, let's just wait and see. It's not only the US and China that have a deal. The US and the UK have a deal, I understand. So I think what we're going to see, see US tariffs settle around the 10 to 30% mark on most countries, and it's going to be effectively a revenue raiser for the US government. And they may use some of that revenue to try to cut income taxes. We have to wait and see. But look, it's not going to be as disastrous as some people thought.
All right, great to have your perspective as always.